The word unwittingly was once used to describe how casinos were turned into laundromats for dirty money. After this extensive process, how unwitting do you think it was on behalf of government, governing bodies, casinos, and law enforcement?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think the information was there to draw, different conclusions about what was transpiring within the casinos. But as I said in my report, I think there was a failure of will to deal with it. And I don't think that equates to deliberate or witting failure to deal with it, but I do think it does represent a failure of will.
In regards to regulators, there was some failures identified with GPEB, law enforcement, but particularly BCLC. And we heard evidence during the commission that there was almost this theme of a counter-narrative. And you seem to really hit that hard in your report. Was there a reason that it seems that BCLC bared most of the brunt when it came to overseeing governing bodies on the responsibility here?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the last part of your question.
Yeah, so out of the three, GPEB, law enforcement, and BCLC, you spent the most time, especially in your executive summary, talking about how BCLC had a lot of information, but really did not act on that information. And in evidence, we heard that there was also often, within their own newsletters and discourse that was made available, there was almost a counter narrative of where that money was coming from and why or why not it was not suspicious.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that's an accurate characterization of the evidence. If you're asking why that was the case, again, I return to the theme I expressed earlier. I think there was a lack of will that underlay BCLC's approach to the question, and it was difficult for BCLC to deal with some of the issues they had. But there could have been more that was done at that time to deal with those issues, in my view.
And for the purposes of sightlines, we've changed the microphone to the back of the room here. So we have Renee Filippone, CVC, is next.
Thank you.
Obviously, this report takes a look back at money laundering for a significant period of time. When we talk about money laundering right now, what do we know about who is doing this, domestic, international? Are we still looking at money from China? And what are the primary ways this is being done? Is it still casinos? Is it more primarily real estate? When we're trying to understand, if someone needs to be tackling this, where should they be looking?
Yeah. Well, I think that is the reason why I've recommended the AML commissioner, because that person will occupy the position of someone who keeps a careful eye on what's going on in the world of money laundering in the province, and be in a position to identify different areas that come up. Peter German, in his report, referred to money laundering as being akin to whack-a-mole, and I think that's an apt description. It pops up where you least expect it, and it's always important to be looking at different organizations, different ways of doing it. Trade-based money laundering is a good example. That appears to be a very fruitful source of money laundering for some criminal organizations.
Yeah, one of the things that Commissioner Cullen discusses in the report is the extent to which criminal organizations and professional money launderers are opportunistic and adaptable. And they look for opportunities, they look for weaknesses and attempt to exploit them. We saw that in the context of casinos in this province. And it's going to be important for the AML Commissioner and enforcement agencies and governments to be alive to the shifting and opportunistic nature of money laundering if they're going to have success in combating it.
The report obviously takes a look at the role FinTrack does or doesn't play in helping these sorts of investigations. How ineffective, in your mind, has FinTrack been in the ability, in giving the ability for provincial authorities to tackle this?
Well, one of the reasons that that we've recommended a provincial intelligence gathering and an investigative unit is due to the fact that FinTrack doesn't appear to be effective in getting information back to the province's law enforcement units. The FinTrack gets something in the order of magnitude of 30 million reports a year, but gives out 25, something in the order of magnitude of 2,500 reports back to law enforcement, about 350 of which come to British Columbia. So what we're suggesting is that there is a need for much more mobile and malleable enforcement process where intelligence can work with enforcement. So that's why we've recommended that.
Our next question from the room comes from Jeremy Nuttall, The Star.
Thank you.
Hi, you are fairly, you put a lot of blame, I guess, on two federal agencies, that being RCMP and FinTrack. I'm curious if you can tell me if that lack of will, which you spoke of, also applied to these federal agencies?
I'm really constrained in what I can say about federal agencies in my report, and I've tried to ensure that I don't trench on federal jurisdiction because I am a provincially appointed commissioner. But I have looked at the federal response to money laundering in British Columbia in order to identify some of the gaps in order to make recommendations as to what I think are necessary to fill those gaps. So I don't want to get too much into parsing the responses of federal agencies. I think I have to be very cautious about that.
Did you characterize how cooperative they were in this inquiry?
Oh, they were very cooperative.
Next question, Kim Bolin, Vancouver Sun.
Hi, thanks. I have a couple of questions. One is quite specific. You talk about this new investigative and intelligence unit under CFSEU. Would there be embedded prosecutors in this unit? Because one thing I didn't see in my quick, peruse of the executive summary was the fact that we've had a lot of organized crime, money laundering cases where charges have been recommended, sometimes late and then later stayed, which is, of course, a decision of Crown prosecutors. And where would the officers come from for this unit? We have staffing shortages in policing across the province of up to 30% in some jurisdictions, right? So there's generally a staffing shortage among policing agencies in BC. And my second question is very specifically, you talk about expansion of the role of the Civil Forfeiture Office, but like 2 years ago, we had the BC Supreme Court rule the BC Civil Forfeiture Act as unconstitutional. So while there is an appeal underway of that ruling from 2 years ago, in the meantime, does it make sense to expand the powers of something that's been ruled unconstitutional?
Well, with respect to the civil forfeiture question, I'm not in a position to speak in detail about the ruling, although I do have some familiarity with it. It does not address the regime as a whole, but only a specific aspect of it. And the recommendations that Commissioner Cullen is making about an expanded operational capacity and a broader reaching focus will continue to apply regardless of the outcome of that proceeding once it ultimately runs its course. There is Commissioner Cullen identifies a real opportunity for an expanded focus on the part of the Civil Forfeiture Office, which should have a couple of benefits. One is meaningfully impacting on organized crime and disrupting them in a way that that hits where it really hurts, their finances. And the other is that there will be a trickle-down financial benefit to the province, the contribution to provincial revenue from assets that are forfeit through that expanded focus. You asked some questions about the nature of the Intelligence and Investigation Unit, and you're right, it didn't all make its way into the executive summary. But one of the reasons the Commissioner recommends the structure that he does is so that the province has control over hiring, staffing, and the ability to ensure the funding is dedicated to that unit and those positions are filled. And I think there's a hope that there will be a focus on hiring individuals with expertise and a true interest in having an enduring commitment to combating this type of crime, and that those individuals will be used to staff and support this unit as it gets underway and goes about doing its work.
Yeah. And prosecutors? Yeah, and so far as the prosecutors are concerned, I think what we're recommending is that there be a team of prosecutors that are available to give ongoing advice to the police as they work through their investigations, and be in a position to conduct charge approval when the report is finished.
Okay, thanks.
Our next question comes from Frank Chi, Omni.
Commissioner, I noticed that in the report you mentioned about China, especially in the casino transaction, but there is no recommendation on international cooperation in curbing money laundering, especially with law enforcement in China. I guess it's maybe political, legal, policing system difference, especially concerning the code relation between the two countries now. So. Could you elaborate more on why there is no recommendation on international cooperation about money laundering? Because if that's a big factor.
Yes, I think you raise a very good point. Basically, the answer is simply that that's a matter that falls within the purview of the federal government, and it falls outside of my jurisdiction to be able to make recommendations to the federal government about what they should or shouldn't do vis-a-vis liaising or engaging in a joint enterprise with another government.
The Commissioner does, throughout the report, though, speak to the importance of coordination and cooperation as between governments.
And a follow-up question about the housing affordability and money laundering issue. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? Because when Minister Eby, when he was not the minister yet, he is alleging that the money laundering, especially within the Chinese community, Chinese-Canadian community, is a big factor in driving up property price in Vancouver. So how do you come to the conclusion that there is no illicit, say, link between property price and the money laundering?
Well, my conclusion is a little more nuanced than that. But my view after hearing the evidence, particularly from members of CMHC, is that the causes of the housing unaffordability in the Lower Mainland primarily relates to low interest rates, high demand, and low supply. And that's really the driver, in my view, of high prices in the Lower Mainland. I think if the provincial government were to implement the recommendations which I've made, they ought not to expect that the issue and the very problematic issue of housing unaffordability in the Lower Mainland will be solved by that.
Our next question comes from Martin McMahon, City News 1130.
Hi, Commissioner. Just a question. Your report touches on the BC Liberal government and some of the actions that it took when it learned about some of these money laundering issues. Based on what you've looked at throughout this whole process, given the information that those ministers had, did the government take reasonable steps at that time, given what those officials knew?
I think the government took reasonable steps, but not sufficient steps. That may seem a bit contrary to put it that way, but they definitely did take steps. But the steps weren't up to the task of abating money laundering in casinos, which was the major problem at that time.
And I think in the report, the word failures is used in relation to some of the decisions or the decisions that were not made. What was the biggest failure from the government of the day?
Well, I want to just be clear. The report discusses the actions of certain individuals, and it's sometimes convenient to use the term government to apply to those actions. But in the report, the Commissioner's discussion is focused on the actions of individuals who held key positions at critical times. And one of the key failings that he identifies is the failure of certain individuals to ensure that suspicious funds that were being received weren't contributing to the provincial revenue stream.
We have one more question in the room before we go to the phones. We hear from Sam Cooper, Global National.
Thanks. Sort of following on that, Commissioner Cullen, you spent some time on the IPOC investigation and Barry Baxter's involvement in it, and we know from federal evidence that the unit said that certain casinos were using foreign nationals as willing pawns in significant money laundering. So that's a pretty high-level assertion. Now we have Mr. Baxter going public with some more guarded comments, Mr. Coleman reacting to him, and you have found, well, Mr. Coleman essentially rebuking him, I think, fair. So you said Coleman's comments, quote, posed a real risk of misleading the public into believing there was no basis for concern about suspicious transactions in the province casinos at a time when Mr. Coleman had good reason to believe that there was cause to be worried. So my question is that not an indication of comments that could have the effect of impeding the will or the direction of the RCMP to look into money laundering in BC, indeed possibly Canada? Well,
yes. I mean, I think that's why I identified those comments and made my findings in relation to them.
Okay, we're going to go to the phone lines next. From Victoria, we'll hear from Rob Shaw, Check News. Rob, please go ahead.
Hi, Commissioner. Could you re-summarize for us why you did not find any corruption on the part of officials involved in this, specifically the politicians?
Yeah, I can, Rob, thanks for the question. I can sort of point you to some of the Commissioner's findings in that regard. He's concluded that, well, some officials could have done more and in some cases should have done more. None of those failures were motivated by the hope of personal, financial, political, or some other type of gain. So in short, there were failings, but they were not motivated by a corrupt purpose.
Rob, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. Back to the Commissioner again. There is a section here on former Premier Christy Clark and a conclusion that her response, kind of overseeing the government and prioritizing its actions, was inadequate, and she shares at least some of the blame for the continuation of money laundering in casinos. Could you expand on that and her role as Premier being particularly important and why you came to those conclusions?
I don't think I can expand on that. I think I have to let the report speak for itself.
Our next question, also from Victoria, is from Dirk Meissner, Canadian Press. Dirk, please go ahead.
Hi, Commissioner. I also wanted to focus a bit on the politicians. In testimony of former ministers Coleman, Bond, and de Jong, and the former Premier Christy Clark, they all testified that they knew some sort of suspicious activity was happening at casinos. But they all sort of were saying, well, there's no smoking gun, so we're just, we'll try something, but we'll let things go as we'll try to make some help it out or fight it somehow, but it's going to keep going. I'm just wondering what you feel about all their responses and their actions that they took.
Well, I don't think that's all that they did. I mean, I think in the case of Mr. Coleman, for example, he engaged Rob Croker to look into the issue of money laundering in casinos. In the case of Mr. de Jong, he was responsible for setting in motion the pieces to get Jiggit established. So I think there were things that were done by members of that government that were designed to attempt to come to grips with the issue of money laundering in casinos.
Derek, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. Can you also comment on why you say the RCMP were underplaying money laundering in British Columbia for those years?
Sorry, for what? I missed your last.
For not investigating, not investigating money laundering the way they should have.
I don't know that the Commissioner uses the word underplaying. I think he finds that there was a lack of priority and a lack of resources dedicated to the investigation of and ultimately fight against money laundering by law enforcement in this province for a significant period of time.
All right, we'll come back to the room now. We hear from Jason Proctor, CBC.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned a little while ago there was a failure of will, I think you called it. What, from your experience and from the evidence that you saw, can you speak a bit more about that, what the origins of that failure of will are, so that the current governments can learn from that, I suppose?
Well, I don't know that I can. I'm just describing the effect of inaction over a period of time in the face of significant concern about dirty money entering the casino industry. And I don't think I can tell you what the well springs of that are. I can tell you what I observed through the evidence.
So part of the question about failures in my mind, when one then turns to look to the future, and I think the report addresses this, is to say, and the Commissioner in his opening remarks a few moments ago referred to the concept of money laundering being, for a long time, not the focus and not the subject of public and regulatory and law enforcement attention. And one of the things to deal with that problem is one of the signal recommendations in the report is the creation of an anti-money laundering commissioner, and that office would be in a position to ensure, including with public reporting on a regular basis, that there isn't a similar failure of the will, that it's not a topic that is up on the agenda this year but slides down the agenda in 2 or 4 years from now, that there's a consistent and an exclusive focus on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to the phones to hear from Bob Mackin, Breaker News. Bob, please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. A question for Brock Marland and Commissioner Cullen. The Commission wasn't able to hold the federal government accountable, but municipalities are creatures of the provincial government. Why weren't any current or former mayors, councillors, chiefs of staff, bureaucrats from Vancouver and Richmond called to testify? And on the same token, Paul King-Gin's lawyer was a participant, but you didn't call Paul King-Gin to testify. You didn't hear from any real estate developers. Premier Horgan himself, he's a former casino lobbyist. We didn't hear from him. That's a long list of people that weren't heard from. Can you explain your reasoning for not going to those people and calling to testify?
It is a
I'll try, Bob, to take an answer, and I suspect you'll get an upgrade when the Commissioner answers. I think from a Commission Council point of view, as we worked our way collectively to figure out what evidence to lead and where to focus, although it did take a long time to do all of this work and run these hearings and put forward the evidence, on the other hand, I don't think we pretended ever that we'd be perfectly comprehensive, and without taking a decade and costing much, much more, we couldn't be comprehensive. So I think the Commissioner's approach to this was to focus on areas where there are identified risks and concerns, and then to make decisions about where to lead evidence. Where there was evidence pointing to particular periods of time with a higher risk or higher set of concerns, that was generally where we focused our attention, and we did make judgment calls, if you will, in terms of who would be brought in as witnesses and where the attention fell. I don't disagree that there are, you've named a few people, I'm not speaking about them specifically, but no doubt a list of others who people would have wanted to hear from. But the nature of the inquiry is that we're balancing trying to be informed and give the public the benefit of the Commissioner's analysis and recommendations, but also to get the job done and not to let it go adrift and not to take 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Brock, that part of what we're attempting to do is bring the Commission in more or less on time and more or less on budget, and not plunge down. I'm going to use the term rabbit holes. I don't mean these are simply rabbit holes, but plunge down areas that are going to get us caught up in much more activity than we want to. But one of the reasons I've recommended the Anti-Money Laundering Commissioner is really to serve that purpose on an ongoing basis, so that person can look at the very things that you're talking about, Mr. Mackin, including municipal governments and other agencies that are at play in this area.
Bob, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. You didn't really need 10 years. Your commission spent only 3 years. Maybe 4 years would have been more suitable, like the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec. That lasted 4 years. Unlike the Charbonneau Commission, it doesn't appear that you recommended any charges. And I also note that the province regulates securities, but the commission really didn't go down the road to look at money laundering and fraud in markets. And there's several British Columbians right now who are facing charges in the U.S. for fraud and money laundering. And BC has a long history of fraud and money laundering in stock markets. Why did you shy away from that big money area?
I think it's fair to say the Commission shied away from anything. The Commission identified areas of most significant concern and opportunity for the province and led evidence on those, and the Commissioner has analyzed those and made recommendations. You refer to a lack of recommendation for the charges, and that is just simply not what a provincial commission is about. Provincial commissioner is not, it would be inappropriate for a provincial commissioner to make findings of civil or criminal liability. His job is to fulfill his mandate, which is to conduct an investigation and analysis of the evidence that is before him with a view to making recommendations to the province to address the problems identified or the issues identified in terms of reference.
Now we'll come back to the room for our final two questions. First of the two is Graham Wood, Glacier Media. Graham, please go ahead.
Hi. We heard about how lottery officials took big bonuses, and we're talking about how there's a failure of will. Can you elaborate on, did you figure out why there was a failure of will?
Well, I think there was a period of ambiguity and uncertainty about what this money was, where it was coming from. And until it crystallized into certainty in the summer of 2015, there was a lack of will to deal with it. I think that's the best answer I can give you there.
So how do you prove corruption other than bags of cash transacting? You know, how do you prove, like, how do you determine what corruption is, and how do you prove it, and how do you come to that determination?
I think in the context of this inquiry, the Commissioner was looking to see, when looking for corruption, whether there was a failure to act or some action that was taken to facilitate money laundering in order to obtain a personal benefit, whether that be financial, political, or otherwise. And through a fairly thorough investigation, while he found failures, he did not find they were motivated by a corrupt purpose.
So talking about how government coffers were, plumped up through this activity, was that not a political gain on the part of the politicians in terms of speaking in relation to the failure of will?
The Commissioner has identified a failure of will that failed to prevent illicit cash from contributing to the province's revenue, but he does not find that any of the inactions or failures were motivated by a corrupt purpose on the part of any of the individuals he discusses.
And our final question today comes from Amelia Macour, CBC Radio-Canada.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I was just wondering regarding the whole corruptions of politicians, especially Mr. Cullen and Mrs. Clark. With everything that Dave said, and you said that there was no indication of a personal gain, so this is why there was no indication of corruption. But how do you, in your report, in your investigation, how did you prove that there was no personal gain there? Like, what evidence did you have to prove that?
The Commissioner was directed in his terms of reference to determine whether any action or inaction was motivated by corruption. As he indicated in his opening comments, the Commission conducted a thorough investigation, thousands of hours of investigation, interviews, examination of extensive documentation, almost 200 days of hearings almost 200 witnesses heard from, over 130 or 40 days of hearings. And throughout all of that, there was no evidence that the Commissioner identified that supported a finding of a corrupt purpose on the part of those officials you've identified.
So is it solely based on hearsay, like testimony, or is there actual factual proof that they didn't have a hand in anything?
It's always difficult to prove a negative, and the Commission is not about proving or disproving anything. It's an inquisitorial process where the job of the Commission, Council, and ultimately the Commissioner is to get at the truth. So there was a thorough inquiry done, and the findings of the Commissioner in that regard are set out in his report.
Just checking, Brock, do you have anything to add before we wrap?
I actually did on that last point, and I know it's hard to interject when I'm by phone. In terms of the questions about corruption, that is the terms of reference for this commission directed the commissioners to examine that question and make findings. We conducted investigations to look precisely for evidence of that nature. The report speaks to that. The executive summary speaks to that and says there was no corruption. And I hear in some of the questions maybe a note of disappointment, but maybe I'm reading into it. But I would have thought it's a good thing that a process like this leads to a conclusion that even after looking for it, there wasn't corruption. But of course, readers will be the judge as they look at the report. And I know it's easy to say read an 1800 report, but there is a lot of detail. There's a lot more than we're able to cover in this sort of a back and forth. And I would encourage people to read through particular sections to have the exact words of the Commissioner.